As we begin the second day of our work together, I suspect some of you are wondering why it is we're spending quite a bit of time this first week, actually the first 4 days and the first 60 pages of our reading in the textbook, talking about prefatory matters, that we're not actually getting to the New Testament. Some of you may be kind of antsy about that. So I thought I would begin our work for the second day by focusing on the opening verse in the Gospel of Mark, and to point out some of the ambiguities of that opening verse in the Gospel of Mark, to suggest why it is that we spend some time talking about Jewish and Greco-Roman backgrounds of the New Testament, to appreciate the way in which audiences in the first century might have heard those words that Mark chooses to open the Gospel with. Mark, which, as you will discover by the end of the week, considered to be the earliest of the New Testament Gospels, but not written until 40 years after the events of Jesus' life. So I've given you a link to a handout that accompanies these remarks that I'm making here, and they give you the opening verse of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 1. And that opening verse reads, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." And that opening verse on your handout is followed then by the actual Greek words that appear in the Gospel of Mark, with a rather literal translation of those Greek words. But I want to walk you through that first verse from the Gospel of Mark, and to suggest how you would hear that verse, first if you were a Jewish reader of the Gospel, and second how you would hear that opening statement if you were a Greco-Roman reader of the Gospel. And then I want to say a bit about how Mark may be playing with the ambiguity of that language and the variety of readers and hearers in his audience, to set us up to play off our presuppositions about what we think we know about these words and what we think we might know about this character, Jesus. So the Gospel begins with the word "the beginning," arche in Greek. If you're a Jewish reader and you hear that word arche, the beginning, and you're a Jewish reader of the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, you immediately think of the opening of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And those of you who know the story of the opening chapters of the book of Genesis know that it is not only about the creation of the cosmos and the creation of the Garden of Eden, but also about the relationship between human beings and God, and particularly about the first transgression that human beings make against the commandment of God. And so you hear the word "the beginning," and you immediately think of themes from the very beginning of the Jewish scriptures, and from the relationship between people and God that go all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos. And ultimately, you think about how that relationship between God and human beings was broken, and about how the giving of the law and the election of the Jewish people was a means by which God sought to restore that relationship between God and humankind. That whole set of associations is set up just by that opening word, "the beginning." But let's say you're a Greco-Roman reader of the Gospel of Mark, and you don't know about the book of Genesis, and you read the word "the beginning." Well, you may simply think it's the beginning of a work, which it is. It's the beginning of this book that you've picked up that has come to be known as the Gospel of Mark. So it's indicating that you're at chapter 1, line 1 of this unfamiliar book that you're reading. But But if you're a Greco-Roman reader and you see the word the beginning, arche, you might also come from a background of Greco-Roman ethics, and you know that that word has a technical meaning in ethical discussions, which is it means the norm. So this book could be understood as providing some sort of norm or guideline or paradigm or parade example of what this kind of work is. Well, as you begin and continue reading the Gospel of Mark, it seems to be an ancient biography. So what would this author mean by saying that this is the norm of a biography of this person called Jesus? What might that mean? A norm for a life, or a biography of a person called Jesus? There's a certain amount of ambiguity there that is set up by your expectations about the word arche, which means norm. There are similar sorts of ambiguities as you push through the sentence. So it is the beginning, the arche, of the good news. The Greek word that Mark uses there is euangelion. It's a composite word. Eu means good or excellent. Angelion means news or message. Euangelion, by the way, is the basis for our English word evangelist. You might recognize the angelion part as looking a lot like the word angel. And in fact, in Greek, an angelos is a messenger. Not always a divine messenger, but any sort of messenger. But it says that this is the beginning, the arche of the euangelion, the good news or the good message. If you're a Jewish reader and you see euangelion, you know that that word first appears in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Isaiah, the prophet, who writes in the 8th century before the Common Era, and the latter part of that book derives from the 6th century before the Common Era. And the word euangelion is used by the prophet Isaiah in a very particular way. It is used to talk about God's intervening activity on behalf of Israel, to save Israel from foreign domination, from foreign influence, from the oppression of outsiders and foreign overlords. So the word euangelion is always used within the context of God's deliverance, of God's saving activity on behalf of Israel. So it sets up a certain kind of expectation. Well, this is the beginning of an announcement about God's delivering activity, God's liberating activity, God's saving activity. This is what we expect the book is going to be about if we're Jews. But let's say we're Greco-Roman readers of the Gospel of Mark and we see the word euangelion, good message. Well, for Greco-Roman readers, it also has a very technical meaning. It's almost always used with respect to the emperor, with the Roman imperial structure of government. A euangelion is a special message, a good message about the emperor, about victory in battle, or about a particular political triumph, about something the emperor is doing with the Senate, or perhaps about the birth of a male heir in the emperor's family. So it sets up another entirely different set of expectations if you're a Greco-Roman reader. So it's the beginning of a good message about the emperor Jesus. Is that what this book is about? If you're a Greco-Roman reader, you're immediately set up to expect certain things when that word euangelion appears. But what is meant by this book that deals with this character Jesus? A book that deals with not only his earthly ministry in Galilee, but also his unexpected crucifixion by the Romans. What could that possibly mean? How could that be euangelion? And so then the beginning of the good message is followed by the name Jesus. If you're a Jewish reader, the name Jesus is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name Joshua. Joshua in the Hebrew Bible is one of the military leaders that was responsible for bringing about the occupation of the promised land of Canaan, the land that was promised to Moses in the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. So this is the beginning of a good message about the military hero Joshua. If you're a Jewish reader, that's what you expect. Joshua. Are we going to learn something new about Joshua that we didn't learn in the Hebrew Bible? Or is this a new Joshua, an heir to Joshua? What exactly is this story going to be about? If you're a Greco-Roman reader, the name Jesus, whether it's in Greek or Hebrew, really means nothing. It's a foreign name. It only creates confusion. The name Jesus is followed by Christos in Greek, which, if you are a Jewish reader, means the anointed one, which means that the text could be saying that Jesus is the king, because Jewish kings were anointed, usually by prophets. So is this about Jesus, a Jewish king? Or is it being used in a more technical sense because Christos is the Greek translation for the Hebrew word Mashiach? And so is it declaring that Jesus is the promised and expected Messiah, the heir to the kingdom of David, the one who would carry on the Davidic lineage? Is that's what's being meant? What is not being meant is by using the name or the title Christos as Jesus' last name. Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's a title. But if you're a Jew, you're wondering exactly what that title means. If you're a Greco-Roman reader of the New Testament, Christos also means, of course, anointed one, but there it's not a title in the Greco-Roman world. It simply means someone who's been smeared with oil, usually after a trip to the public baths. It's someone who has finished bathing in the water and has put perfumed oil all over to smell good and to feel good after taking a bath. This story is this is the beginning of a story of good news about someone with a foreign name who's taken a bath. I mean, for a Greco-Roman reader, the confusion abounds in the way in which Jesus is described here. And that's then followed by this phrase, Huios Theou, a son of God. If you're a Jewish reader of this text and you see the phrase, a son of God, there are multiple ways for understanding what that phrase might mean. Because in the Hebrew Bible, a son of God, the phrase a son of God, is one that is used to describe any Israelite. An Israelite, by virtue of his birth, is a son of God. Or a son of God is also a phrase that's used to describe a prophet. So maybe this is going to be the beginning of a good message about Jesus, the anointed one, the anointed prophet of God. Son of God is also used to describe the king. I've already said that anointed one is a phrase that's used of a king. So maybe this is the beginning of the good news of God's deliverance, of providing Jesus, like Joshua, who is an anointed one, who is also a king. But anointed a son of God, we use theou, is also used to describe an angelic messenger. Is this text saying that Jesus is an angelic messenger? That's a possible meaning of a son of God. Or is it saying something else? A son of God in Jewish literature is also a way in which Jews in Hebrew, now being translated into Greek, described a miracle worker. So is this the beginning of the story of a fellow named Jesus who is anointed by God to be a miracle worker? Is that what is meant by this phrase, a son of God? What is almost surely not meant, if you're a Jewish reader of this text, by the phrase, a son of God, is to say that Jesus is divine. No Jew would have read the phrase, a son of God, and understood Jesus as a divine being, much less the second person of the Trinity. Those are concepts that simply were foreign to Judaism. So there are lots of possibilities for the ways in which a Jew would have understood the phrase Son of God. And it requires one to read the whole text to perhaps understand exactly what this author would have intended for Jewish readers to understand by this phrase. But if you're a Greco-Roman reader of the Gospel of Mark, reading it in Greek, and you see the phrase, a son of God, well, a son of God was used to describe the emperor. So, is this text saying that Jesus is somehow a replacement for the emperor, or someone who will succeed the emperor? Perhaps. The phrase Son of God was also used in the Greco-Roman world to describe a miracle worker. So a fellow that we're going to be introduced to in a couple of days, Apollonius of Tyana, was certainly called a son of God because he was a great miracle worker, a healer. So is that what the Gospel of Mark means by describing this Jesus, this foreign named person, as a son of God? Perhaps. But the phrase is also used in Greco-Roman literature to describe a hero, someone who accomplished great deeds in the history of the Roman Empire, someone who was a military hero, or someone who was the main character of a legend that described heroic behavior, perhaps as a sailor, or as a soldier, or someone who did good deeds on behalf of the empire. But another way of understanding the phrase a son of God is to describe someone who was a semi-divine being, someone who had a divine father who had mated with a human woman to produce a kind of combined human being who contained both human aspects as well as divine aspects. A semi-divine being, again, of major import in the history of the Greco-Roman world. And so, if you're a Greco-Roman reader of the Gospel of Mark, it's ambiguous, and you wonder just exactly what is meant by this phrase, Son of God. But this particular phrase in the opening of the Gospel of Mark, you'll see on my handout, is in brackets. And you've been reading in these opening pages of Ehrman's textbook in chapter 1, but also in the appendix that deals with ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament, or of the New Testament rather, I'm sorry, that The text of the New Testament has undergone considerable modifications over the course of its transmission. And in the very best manuscripts of the New Testament, in the oldest and most reliable text families of the Greek New Testament, the phrase Son of God is absent. It's not there. It doesn't become included in texts of the New Testament until the Middle Ages. And so many scholars of the New Testament suggest that the phrase Son of God is not original to the Gospel of Mark, and so it's put in brackets. And when you see it in English versions of the New Testament, like the New Revised Standard Version, which is the basis for the cappuccino colored book that we'll be reading the English text of the New Testament with this quarter, you'll see that Son of God is put in brackets to indicate that it's probably not an original part of the Gospel of Mark. And yet the phrase Son of God is very important in the Gospel of Mark. When we look at the baptism of Jesus, when we look at the transfiguration of Jesus, when we look at the confession of Peter in chapter 8, when we look at the trial of Jesus at the end of the Gospel of Mark, when we look at the soldiers' response to the crucifixion of Jesus at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, that phrase, Son of God, is very important. So perhaps an early copyist in the Middle Ages of the Gospel of Mark recognized that the phrase Son of God was very important to the Gospel, that it occurs throughout the Gospel, and so that copyist added it in the opening line because the copyist knew that it was going to be an important phrase. But the phrase is not original. So we have to take these things into account as we read the opening sentence of the Gospel of Mark. There's lots of ambiguity in that opening sentence. Ambiguity that arises because the words mean different things. If you're a Jewish reader of the Gospel of Mark, or if you're a Greco-Roman Hellenistic reader of the Gospel of Mark, or what if you are a Jewish reader of the Gospel of Mark who lives outside of Palestine and who is familiar with Greco-Roman traditions. All of that is going to impact the way in which you understand that opening phrase. But I'm going to suggest that perhaps the Gospel of Mark uses that ambiguous language for a purpose, because he's attempting to play with people's assumptions about that language, assumptions about Jesus and the way in which they expect to hear the story of Jesus told. And the Gospel of Mark tells the story of Jesus in a surprisingly unique sort of way, a way that upsets all sorts of expectations. And the Gospel of Mark achieves its power by the very ambiguity of this opening phrase, so that we keep coming back to it again and again and again and asking, what does he mean by calling the gospel good news? What does he mean by talking about the norm of the good news? What does he mean by giving Jesus this title, Christ? And what does he mean throughout the gospel by referring to Jesus as Son of God? Well, when we get to the Gospel of Mark on Friday, we'll come back to some of these issues, and your antennae will be alert to picking up on this ambiguity and the startling way in which the Gospel of Mark frames the story of Jesus. And you will appreciate many of the nuances of the Gospel of Mark for having spent some time these first 3 days exploring issues around how the New Testament came to be, exploring issues about the Greco-Roman backgrounds of the New Testament, exploring the world of late antique Judaism and the varieties of Judaism in the first century of the Common Era. All of that's going to enrich your understanding not only of the opening verse of the Gospel of Mark, but the way in which the author of the Gospel of Mark shapes the story of Jesus, and the way the other Gospels use the Gospel of Mark and supplement the Gospel of Mark to provide even more different stories of Jesus. It's just the tip of the iceberg, and I hope this whets your appetite for what's to come.